The Era ITX is the newest ITX offering from Fractal Design. This case looks like no other on the market right now, with a stylish outer casing and a multitude of variants in both colors and side panels available. The Fractal Design Era ITX is available in no less than 5 different colors: cobalt, silver, titanium grey, carbon, and finally gold. The price of this case is around $160 or euros. However, I have seen this case go for much more. The Fractal Design Era ITX has a really good design, which sets apart the case from the usual standard ITX looks. In other words, this case is just stunning from all angles, and for many this would be the main point of buying such a case. However, we must delve deeper into it and see what makes it tick, and more importantly, what makes it worth the asking price. One of the highlights of the Era ITX is the integration of wood in its construction. Well, when I'm saying about construction, I really mean that it is just the top removable panel that can be attached on the top of the case. It's not much, but it is a start into the right direction of being unique. The top panel is held in place, as I've said previously, by magnets, and that's great as it is completely toolless. But don't try to carry the case by pulling on the top panel for some reason, as it won't hold that much weight. I'm just saying, don't complain about it later. You have a choice of 3 top panels if we talk about all the Era ITX cases and their variants. Some variants have either a mesh or a tempered glass top panel, while the other variants have either a wood or a mesh panel. The mesh panel is included either way. In this review, we have the wood and the mesh panels, and while the wood does look better, the mesh panel makes sense in terms of cooling. We start with the side panels themselves, and as you can see, just like the rest of the case, these follow in with the angular design, which is quite lovely. These are also perforated, and they even have pre-installed some good mesh dust filters on the interior side of the panel. And how do you remove these? You just pull on them from the top of the case and they will release from the case frame itself. And everything that holds them down are these small clips. Thankfully, these are made out of metal and look to be quite durable, so breaking them will be quite the challenge. And I am making this statement because I have been there, where plastic clips would break and now you are stuck with a panel that won't close. On the lower side of the case, the base looks to be made from solid aluminum. Unfortunately, it is not. The base is made from solid plastic, which is rather disappointing. However, what is even more disappointing is that while this base plate is made from plastic, for some reason it has no perforations that would have drastically improved the airflow inside the case, especially since the graphics card is facing this side of the case. If the base would have been made from solid aluminum, then it would have more sense, as it would have been sturdy, but plastic and no perforations is just a tragic oversight. Speaking of the cooling, the edges of the base of the case are perforated, fortunately, and have again some sort of angular design. Also, these perforations have a mesh dust filter installed behind them, which is a nice touch. However, the gap for the air is rather small, and now the dust filters are making those spaces even smaller. The case itself sits on 4 rubber strips which are glued to the plastic base plate. This is a simple design that works and prevents the scratching of the surface the case sits on. In addition, it also provides a good grip for the case so it won't slide around. At the front, we have the I/O panel, and it is pretty simple in terms of what it offers and pretty minimalistic in terms of how it looks like. You have a single USB 3.1 Gen 2 Type-C port, 2 USB 3.0 ports, and a single 3.5 combined audio and microphone port. Why is this a combined audio and microphone port is beyond me. As for this price range, I believe that we deserved 2 audio jacks, one for audio only and one for the microphone. But here we are. At the back, there isn't much to talk about. There is a power slot, which is basically a pass-through for your power supply inside the case. Then we have just 2 expansion slots for the graphics cards, which is not unusual as this is after all an ITX case. In order to access these expansion slots, you first have to remove a small silver plate which covers their screw side. Finally, there is a single fan included with the Era ITX, and it is found at the back of the case. This is a Fractal Design Silent Series R3 fan, and it is just a small 80mm fan that has a maximum speed of 1600 RPM. Thankfully, it sits pre-installed on vertical strips that allow for height adjustment of the fan itself. The interior of the Era ITX is pretty good, with a layout that offers plenty of options for storage, graphics card clearance, and power supply clearance. Anyway, we start with the storage options, and there's plenty to talk about here. At the front, right above the motherboard tray, there is a massive plate that spans the entire height of the case. This plate can accommodate either 2 SSDs or a single hard drive. However, using this bracket means that the CPU cooler clearance will be lowered from 120mm, which is with the tray not used at all, or just 70mm with a hard drive installed. Still talking about the storage, on the right side of the case there is a standalone cage, which can accommodate either a single hard drive or again 2 standard SSDs. In terms of the power supply support, the Era ITX can either take an SFX power supply or a full ATX power supply. If you want to use an ATX power supply, however, you are forced to remove that drive cage from the front of the case, and thus your only storage options is going to be that metal tray which is installed on the side of the case. So this is basically a compromise between either storage options or the power supply format. The graphics card clearance is around 295mm if a regular SFX power supply is used, or the clearance is lowered to 210mm if you use a low-mounted SFX power supply. However, the sadness comes next, as if you decide to use an ATX power supply, the graphics card clearance gets lowered further to just 190mm. The water cooling support is interesting. At the top of the case, a 240mm radiator can be installed. And that's it. No, really, that's it for radiators. Also, if you want to have an ATX power supply, well, any thought of a 240mm radiator is out the window. Why? Because the power supply is interfering with the radiator space. So basically, having an ATX power supply means plenty of compromises. With the system installed, we get to see how good the layout of the Era ITX is. However, at the back of the system, things are not looking that bright. There is almost no space at all behind the motherboard tray for cable management, so everything cable-wise will have to be routed inside the system itself. And thanks to the way the power supply is installed, this means that all the cables are going to be bundled together right at the end of your graphics card. And with the system installed, we get into the cooling segment of this review, and here things get tricky. There is no other way of saying this, but that stunning wood panel at the top is more or less restricting the airflow in the system, because the space between the panel itself and the case frame is not that big. Actually, I would call it insufficient for proper airflow. The biggest improvement I got temperature-wise was by completely removing the bottom plastic plate, which allowed the graphics card some breathing room, and there is no pun intended here. And this could have been avoided if that base plate was perforated. And I still do not understand why it is not, as it is made out of plastic anyway. The point of the Fractal Design Era ITX is then to be used with a gaming system that has a mid-range or low-range TDP CPU, and a graphics card that is either using a blower-style cooling system or is on the mid-range side of the spectrum in terms of power consumption. Of course, the main point of the Era is the way it looks, and credit where credit is due, this is one of the best looking cases out there. Also, the build quality is very good, with solid aluminum side panels and a very good looking wood panel. However, there are compromises to be made with this case, especially if you want to use an ATX power supply. However, if all you want is a unique case that is very well built and will look good in any room in your house, then the Era ITX makes more sense. However, if you want to build a high-end gaming system inside this case, well, you are either going to make compromises, or you can look for something that was designed specifically for high-end components that require plenty of cooling. If you liked this review, then you can perhaps consider subscribing for more, and also if you want to support the channel in a direct way, then in the description below you can find both the Patreon and subscriber star pages of this channel.